He trusts more, Putin or Germany's Angela Merkel. Trump called it a draw for now.
Who do you trust more if you talk to them, Angela Merkel or Vladimir Putin?
Well, I start off trusting both, but let's see how long that lasts. It may not last long at all.
In the meantime, NATO is pushing back after Trump once again called the defense alliance obsolete. CNN's Nick Robertson has a reaction to Trump's comments. He's live in London. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Carol. Well, certainly what Donald Trump has said has caused a reaction here in Europe. You have the German foreign minister today in Brussels, where meeting with other European leaders, saying collectively it's caused astonishment and agitation. What he said about Angela Merkel, that her decision to allow in so many refugees into Germany was catastrophic, but also said that he respected her as a leader. His answer about Trump and Merkel, that maybe that would change, that's not clear if he was basing that on an assessment of how he hopes to strike deals with Vladimir Putin over reduction of nuclear weapons at the expense of possibly getting rid of some sanctions against Russia. That was part of the conversation. But he was also very, very critical of NATO. This is what he said.
Among Eastern Europeans, there's a lot of fear of Putin in his Russia.
Sure. And I said a long time ago that NATO had problems. Number one, it was obsolete because it was, designed many, many years ago. Number two, the countries weren't paying what they're supposed to pay.
So he also went on to talk about how German automakers could face 35% trade tariffs bringing cars into the United States. He says there's more Mercedes on Fifth Avenue than you see Chevrolets driving around Germany. An imbalance, he said, that couldn't be allowed to continue, which has had German automakers worried. BMW's lost 2% of its share value today. Daimler the same. Angela Merkel, for her part, is taking this in her stride and saying we knew that he thought these things. Once he's in office, that's when we begin to deal with him and his team. Carol?
All right, Nick Robertson reporting live for us, so let's talk about this some more. With me now is Aaron David Miller. He's a CNN Global Affairs analyst and Vice President for New Initiatives and Distinguished Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. Welcome.
Hey, Carol, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for being here. Mr. Trump refuses to say who he trusts more, Putin or Merkel. Your reaction to that?
You know, we've never had a president-elect quite like Mr. Trump. You've had presidents, George H.W. Bush, who knew foreign policy. You had other presidents, Bill Clinton, who didn't know much, at least when he became president, but didn't choose during the transition period to speak out and try to make or break existing U.S. policy. You have an unpredictable, unconventional president-elect. And I think the Europeans are putting the best face on it by arguing that Mr. Trump has said many things and will be looking to Mr. Trump once he's president to validate what existing U.S. policy is. Look, I think in this case, it's impossible to know. Is this an effort on the part of the president-elect to be unpredictable, to keep allies and adversaries off balance? Is it a negotiating ploy? I mean, only 4 or 5 of the 28 NATO members now pay their fair share of 2% of their GDP to the alliance. That's not necessarily the bottom line, Carol, on the relevance of NATO, but it is in fact true, and 3 former secretaries of defense have all criticized NATO members for not paying their fair share. So is this an effort to create a pay-for-service standard for allies? Is it an effort as a sop to try to make Vladimir Putin more comfortable and to test the proposition that Mr. Trump can cooperate with Mr. Putin? We just don't know. And you know what? In 4 days, the ultimate pivot is coming, when in fact Mr. Trump will bear the responsibility for existing and future U.S. foreign policy.
Well, you know, there is an irony here because Germany fears Russia is planning to interfere at its upcoming election to defeat Angela Merkel. So what do you suppose Germans are thinking about that?
Look, I think the European allies, whether or not they're prepared to say it, are highly concerned, agitated, and worried. You have an alliance that is imperfect but has worked remarkably well over the years. Article 5 has only been invoked once, and that is in the wake of 9/11. And quite contrary to Mr. Trump's claims that NATO is not involved at all in counterterrorism, they deployed troops to Afghanistan. There's a counterterrorism center in Tunisia. They're helping to train troops in Iraq, counterterrorism troops in Iraq and Jordan. So the allies, our allies, are very worried. And we should be as well. If Mr. Trump wants to make America great again, and he harks back to a period when, in fact, America had an effective foreign policy, it did, in fact, have that effective foreign policy in large part because of mechanisms and organizations like NATO. And yet Mr. Trump is questioning the viability and relevance of an organization that I would argue on balance has served American interests well. So, no, I think the Europeans are trying to hope for the best, but clearly they're preparing for the worst.
Okay, well, let's talk about China, because Mr. Trump's comments about the one China policy, China thinks Taiwan is part of China. Taiwan thinks differently, but the United States accepts the one China policy. Mr. Trump has said that's all negotiable. A Chinese newspaper called the Global Times, which is controlled by the China state government, called Mr. Trump arrogant and amateur because he told the Wall Street Journal the one China policy is negotiable. Here's an excerpt from that article. Quote, "We were simply angry initially, but now we can't help but laugh at this U.S. leader in waiting. Maybe American voters promoted him too quickly. His amateur remarks and overconfident manner are equally shocking." Your thoughts?
Again, you have a president who I think is determined to try to rearrange America's traditional patterns of behavior with both Russia and China. With Russia, he's using incentives, the possibility of removing sanctions in order to gain Vladimir Putin's cooperation against the Islamic State. And with China, he appears to be using sticks, questioning the one China policy, accepting the phone call from President Tsai of Taiwan in an effort to get China to change its policy toward the South China Sea as a currency manipulator and on trade. The question is, will any of this work? And I suspect if you go after the Chinese on issues that are of fundamental importance to their national identity and their national security, like Taiwan, I think rather than get compliance, you're going to get a combative, testy China that will push back. So again, Carol, I wish I could be authoritative on exactly what Mr. Trump is thinking and how, in fact, he's actually going to conduct foreign policy once he becomes president. But I think that's simply impossible. We've never quite seen a president-elect like this, questioning the assumptions on which there are fundamental principles of American policy for the last 50, 60 years. And I think at a minimum, allies are incredibly nervous about U.S. commitments. And adversaries, particularly Mr. Putin, I don't think it's Christmas in the Kremlin, but I think Mr. Putin is awaiting anxiously the possibility of further trying to manipulate the United States and divide the United States from its NATO allies.
Got to leave it there. Aaron David Miller, thanks for your insight.